So again, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Barr as part of our Tuohy lectureship this year. He's provided us with some interesting, insightful, and stimulating lectures. And I also wanted tonight to introduce you to his wife, who's been attending, Mary Kenton, who is sitting there in the front there. She and David have been wonderful additions to our community this semester, and we're very happy that both of them are here. For those of you who were here in previous weeks, again, I want to welcome you back. For those who are here for the first time in this series, you're here for the last of the series. The lecture series this year is Jerusalem, Jesus, and Jihad, End-Time Scenarios in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And as I said before, this is this year's presentation, the Walter and Mary Tuohy Lectures in Interreligious Studies. This chair, as I've indicated to many of you, was first established in 1966 and is thus one of the first ecumenical chairs established in American University. We're very privileged to have that chair here. Very honored to be able to bring lectures and discussions in interreligious studies to you. Our lecturer this spring is Dr. David L. Barr, professor of religion at Wright State University. Dr. Barr achieved his PhD at Florida State University, has published 8 books, authored more than 35 articles and over 25 reviews, and delivered dozens of scholarly lectures. This is supporting what you already know, that we have a well-qualified scholar with us this evening, who has provided us with engaging and informative lectures. I also want to warn you again to be sure to be alert for the quiet humor, which will surely emerge. Last week, David Barr addressed the various issues and ideas associated with the Second Coming, and describe the ways that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam speak about that Second Coming, whether it is the Messiah, Jesus, or the Mahdi. Tonight he will conclude the series by looking at contemporary examples and political implications of the idea of end times. The lecture is entitled, The Politics of End Times Today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Barr.
Meet Melody, the apocalyptic cow. Prophetic sign of the end time. Only she wasn't. She denied her eschatological role by a clump of gray hairs that grew out of her tail when she was about 2 years old, missing her chance to fulfill the scripture that required that such an animal be found that is pure and spotless. Well, more about Melody later. Now, I find this mildly amusing, but it can be deadly serious. If Melody had been around in 1984 and had proven to be the true red heifer needed for sacrifice, there was a group of Jewish settlers intent on blowing up the Dome of the Rock, only they couldn't figure out how to get up there without becoming defiled or defiling the place because they didn't have the proper purification ritual. They wanted to destroy it, of course, so they could build a third temple and facilitate the coming of the Messiah. Again, more a little bit later. And apparently one of the men responsible for the Boston massacre gave religious justification, quoting a hadith, that an army from the east would be unstoppable, and that he was going to fulfill that kind of prophecy. Osama bin Laden is also fond of this particular hadith, although it's my understanding that it lacks very strong credentials. Well, tonight I want to consider the relationship between end-time scenarios that we've been examining and politics. And I need to remind you what I told you the first week, and have proven in subsequent weeks. I'm not an expert on any of these 3 religions, nor am I a theologian. I do not ask whether a religious belief is true. I ask how it works, how it functions in human lives. That is, I do not study God as a theologian might. I study people, humans, as a religion scholar does. I seek the human meaning. What does it mean for people to believe or to do these things? Of course, once I see how it works, I may have some opinion on whether it's a valuable thing or not. I repeatedly made the basic distinction between formal beliefs, in which all Christians, Jews, and Muslims have formal beliefs about the end times, and functional beliefs, that is, beliefs that cause them to act in a certain way that other people do not feel compelled to, who do not have that same functional belief. The majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe in the end times, but they don't take it very seriously. They're not very concerned about it. A few are. Each of these religions has an active minority intensely concerned about the end, and the belief that belief has an influence on how they live. This concern for the end, what I call the apocalyptic angst, is born of the conviction that the world is not as it ought to be. They seek a solution in which God's rightful rule is restored. On the face of it, a noble ambition, but some seek a perfect solution, a time when God rules completely. For Orthodox Jews, a secular Israel is not adequate. For fundamentalist Christians, a secular America is not a solution to the problem. For Salafi Muslims, a secular state is not the solution. Each imagines the coming of a world of peace and justice ruled by God, but their God, of course, and their religious tradition is the one that will dominate. Unfortunately, this always involves the defeat of the other, probably the conversion, perhaps the destruction of those not of their tradition. Over the past 5 weeks, I've tried to build a sense of the shared and distinctive scenarios of the end of days Judaism, or the last days Christianity, or the hour Islam. Their basic end-time scenarios involve three aspects. The conviction that they live near the end, not just that the end is coming, but that they live in, if history is written in chapters, they're in the last chapter. They just don't know how close to the last page of the chapter they are. They also believe that they face an adversary who is satanic in its dimensions, and that they believe that this adversary will be defeated in a final battle of righteous violence. Now, it remains to be asked, what we're going to do tonight is how they imagine this coming about. What are the politics of the second coming? And there are only two options: wait for it or work for it. One school of thought teaches that God's kingdom is God's work, and God will bring the Messiah and Jesus will come, or the Mahdi will appear in his own time and in his own way. But a second school of thought teaches that, as John Kennedy once said, God has no hands but our hands to do his work today, and that they can do something to bring about the coming of the kingdom. Like the bike you got for Christmas, some assembly required. As one radical Jewish website put it, there's a series of things that God promises will happen. First the land, then the gathering of the exiles, then good judges, an ideological victory, a strengthening of the people, a building of Jerusalem, including the temple, and then the appearance of the Messiah. And then it muses, maybe this would work better if we didn't wait for this to happen, if we sort of did some of these things ourselves, not made the Messiah do them all, but pushed the process along. Of course, pushing along God seems quite impossible to other Jews and to some Christians and Muslims. But still, the basic distinction between waiting and working is found in all three traditions. With the activists increasing their influence, this is not a new divide. In fact, I'm going to start with an older example. There should be a place to lay things down. I'm going to start with an older example of this division from Christianity and use that as a paradigm to talk about the others. That's the distinction between premillennialism and postmillennialism. Near the end of John's apocalypse, there's a brief reference to Jesus' followers ruling on earth for 1,000 years, after which the struggle with evil would resume. This is known as the millennium, meaning 1,000. And interpreters have taken different approaches to it. Some see it as symbolic, some see it as literal. But whether symbolic or literal, the question is, how long is 1,000 years? And when, in relation to that 1,000 years, will Christ come? As John's apocalypse is not entirely clear when the second coming occurs, some believe it occurs before the millennium, conveniently called the premillennialist, and some believe it'll occur after the millennium, and you can probably guess what they're going to be called, the postmillennialist. In general, premillennialists are pessimists. They think human nature is flawed, and the world is in a dire state and will not get better. In fact, it will get worse and worse. This is what I call the losing team eschatology. The worse things get, the better off you are, because the end is near, the worse things get. So these people believe that as things get entirely bad, Then, before the millennium occurs, Jesus will return and bring the kingdom. Postmillennialists are generally more optimistic about both human nature and the present situation. American examples of premillennialists are the Millerites we talked about last week, Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, and others of that school. American postmillennialists include the Puritans and what's called the social gospel movement. Now, the fact that you don't know either of them tells you that they have sort of fallen out of favor in American life. But there is a school trying to bring something like that back. More in a minute. So in brief, one school waits for Jesus to return when he will inaugurate the millennial kingdom. The other school works to establish the kingdom, preparing the way for his return. As Kafka remarked in a different setting, the Messiah will come only when he's not needed any longer. Within Christianity today, two relatively new schools of thought correspond roughly to the pre- and post-millennialist positions. They're called dispensationalism and dominionism. Have you heard of either one? Good. I can be the expert. Both are movements within evangelical Protestantism, for as we have seen, Roman Catholics tend toward a spiritualized eschatology, and mainstream Protestants tend toward a general belief in the second coming, but without much conviction or urgency. Dispensationalism grows out of the disappointment following the Millerite episode, when the second coming was called for but did not happen. There was some disillusionment about how you talk about the end, and that provided an opening for a new approach. This new approach came from England. An Irish nonconformist preacher by the name of John Nelson Darby invented, he would have said discovered, a new teaching in Scripture that he called the rapture. No one had ever thought of that before. But he took the passage in Thessalonians where Paul says Jesus will come and we will meet him in the clouds. And so he says that means we go up, not he comes down. So he invented a sort of second and a half, or 1.5 comings of Jesus. He comes part way, takes all his people out of the world, and leaves the rest behind, which gives this movement its other name, the Left Behind movement. Well, Darby made several trips to America where he won converts to his new scheme, including two of the most influential evangelicals of the time, Dwight L. Moody and C.I. Scofield. Scofield produced an extremely popular annotated Bible applying this thinking to the whole of the Bible. I used to carry one around with me wherever I went, as did most evangelicals of that epoch. Dispensationalists differed somewhat as to when the rapture would occur. Some thought it would happen before the tribulation, during it, or after it. But the before it position is dominant. Those not taken in the rapture are left behind to suffer a period of tribulation. The urgency of the rapture, of being one of those not left behind, and the horror of being left behind, provided a motive for pious living and missionary work that was unparalleled in the 19th century. It also provided a justification for ignoring social issues, because if the world is about to end, you don't need to really be concerned about the great movements of the 19th century, the abolition of slavery and the combating of alcohol. Dispensationalism had a major rebirth in recent years, popularized by a series of books called the Left Behind series. Well, that's a chart of how the dispensationalists see history. They call dispensationalists because they see history divided up into different epochs in which God dispenses his love differently to people. Either 7 of them as this chart, or 10, or perhaps only 4. They could argue about these things. And each dispensation had a different way in which God related to people, and each culminated in judgment. And our age, the age of grace, is about to end in the Great Tribulation. These Left Behind books, I want you to look at the images on the covers, not just the books themselves. You get some sense of how this author conceives of the world. It's indicative that Tim LaHaye, the co-author of the Left Behind novels, he's on your far right, so to speak, in the picture. He's also the founder of the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell, the organizer of the Council for National Policy, a politically conservative and highly secretive think tank, founder of the American Coalition for Traditional Values, as well as the Institute for Creation Research. In other words, a perfect match to my earlier description of end times advocates as opposing science, secular institutions, and gender equality. The Left Behind novels paint a picture of the world completely merging evangelical beliefs and right-wing politics. It's easy to draw the following conclusion from reading these novels. There's a clandestine conspiracy of financial interests that scheme to control the world. Very like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, by the way. The global disarmament is a tool of the devil. Catholicism is a partner of the Antichrist. She is the whore of Babylon. And the seemingly admirable acts of Pope Francis would only confirm that, because, of course, the Antichrist is supposed to appear good and pious at the beginning. Only later will he be revealed to be the demonic power that he is. All other religions are the work of the devil. Only Christianity, and really only fundamentalist Christianity, is the true religion. Now, Jews are a special case since they are God's people. Israel must keep all the territory of the Holy Land and must build the third temple. God will deal with the Jews during the tribulation, and they will either be converted or killed. It's hard to miss the violent imagery and scenes enacted in this book. Truly disturbing ideas for me. As we will see, the role of the Jews, the land, the temple, will also figure in the views of Jews and Muslims about the end times. Traditionally, the premillennialists have been quietist. Their motto is waiting for the kingdom, waiting for God to take them out of the world. In fact, rapture theology has been the primary means of avoiding involvement in social problems. You don't need to worry about what your grandchildren are going to do because the world will end before then. But the imaginative merging of right-wing political views and end-time events has encouraged a more active political engagement, especially mistrust of the United Nations, support for military expansion, creationism, school choice, and other conservative causes. And evangelicals have been stirred to action by another evangelical movement, much smaller, much less public, but much more serious and influential beyond its numbers. This is called Christian Reconstructionism or denominationalism. No, that's not right. Dominionism, that'll work. It's not likely you've heard of them. They keep a low profile, but you might remember Rick Perry's prayer meeting in Radiant Stadium when he kicked off his presidential run, where 30,000 gathered to pray for him. The opening prayer that God would have dominion over the government was not mere sentiment, for the event was organized, executed, and paid for by groups subscribing to dominionist ideology. They take their clues from two verses in the Bible, Genesis 1:28, where humanity is given dominion over all the earth, key word being dominion, and Matthew 28:18, where the risen Jesus claims that all power in heaven and earth has been given to me. Among the earthly powers, apparently, is the power to control the United States government and to enact God's laws in this country. Now, a footnote. They apparently fail to see the contradiction between Genesis, which gives this power to humanity, and Matthew, which gives it to Jesus. Seems to me that you can build a democracy on the first one, but perhaps not on the second one. Now, the ideology is characteristic of several different groups. There's a charismatic wing and a Puritan Calvinist wing, but they share this basic underlying ideology. They draw their inspiration from Calvin's Geneva, where Calvin attempted to set up God's kingdom on earth, and they think they're doing the same thing that the Puritans are doing, which, if you recall your American history, the Puritans came here not for religious freedom, but to establish their version of religion as the true faith and to build a city set on the hill. Neither of them worked out very well. The movement is centered in a group of scholars working in the Chalcedon Foundation in California, whose explicit goal is to overcome the secular humanism of modern institutions by conforming them to biblical models. They're not theocrats. They believe in the separation of church and state. They don't think priests should rule, but they think God should rule because the people who do rule should enact God's laws. And this includes all the laws of the Old Testament should be brought into the American legal system. It's sort of like Sharia for fundamentalists. It began in the 60s with a Calvinist pastor by the name of J.R. Rushdoony, who thought he could create God's kingdom on earth and use the medieval Roman Catholic Church as his model, a church that controlled virtually all areas of life. Their idea is that you will elect leaders like Rick Sanctorum who will enact God's law into the American system. And they would go so far as to include the penalty of death for adultery and homosexuality as part of the law that they find in the Bible. But the law is limited to the biblical model. And thus they advocate a very limited government. There's no social welfare legislation, little curb on economic activity. The only law against borrowing money is you can only do it for 7 years, because that's the biblical model. Now, few evangelicals follow them completely, but they've been a major force in turning evangelicals from political isolation to political action. They have been called to the think tank of the religious right. Their motto is creating the kingdom of God. Now, the Tea Party shares many of these same goals, although they tend to be more pessimistic than optimistic about America's future, whereas the Dominionists are fairly optimistic about the possibility of transforming America into God's kingdom. These are the folks who display the Ten Commandments, decry the lack of prayer in schools, want to pretend that this is a Christian nation. Their major impetus behind homeschooling. They want to teach the law and avoid secular methods. Common elements are mistrust of government, social conservatives, strong connections to libertarians. As one of their leaders wrote, what I found was that the concept of the rule of law was Mosaic, not Greek. The concept of private property is supported by the Ten Commandments. The Bible is pro-market, pro-conservative enterprise, private ownership, pro-foreign trade, pro-money lending. That comes as a news to most people who study the Old Testament, but he quotes Deuteronomy there that says, you shall loan but not borrow to the other nations. He ends by saying that like the early Christians struggle with Rome, Christianity is a dagger pointed at the heart of the Messianic state. It still is. So they actively oppose social legislation because that's the work of God. The redemption is the work of the church and should not be the work of the state. We're far from the traditional quietism of evangelicals. We're also pretty far from an accurate portrayal of history. In actual practice today, evangelicals favor the dispensational scheme, but more and more practice the activism of the Dominionist ideology, seeming not to notice the contradiction between the two. Now, I've spent some time on these dual Christian strategies in order to set them up as an overlay on similar tensions between waiting and working in Judaism and Islam. So a quick review of a couple of movements there. The majority of Jews are not oriented to the end times, except perhaps when it comes to Israel. Brenda Brasher has suggested that we can discern 5 types of millennial thinking in Israel: secular millennialism, practical Zionism, Messianic religious Zionism, Jewish Messianism, and Christian millennialism. Setting aside the Christians, I've been waiting to say that a long time, we have basically 2 issues and 2 approaches to each. The issues are Zionism and Messianism, with each eliciting a secular practical view and a religious end times view. We will examine religious Messianic Zionism and Jewish Messianism, both stemming from that part of the Jewish spectrum known as the ultra-Orthodox. Now, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 was an apocalyptic event. And by that I mean it was on the apocalyptic timelines of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Not all Jews saw it as a good thing. The Orthodox saw 2 problems. It was supposed to be a perfect society. The first phase is the ushering in of the kingdom of peace and prosperity. And secondly, it was supposed to be the work of God. It failed on both counts. The age-old tradition of the Jewish people that God would one day redeem them, send the Messiah, regather the people from the exile, and establish a utopia of justice and peace didn't quite work out. The Zionist success in establishing a new Jewish homeland was far from utopia, far from justice, far from peace. Now, for secular Jews, the majority of Israelis, this is a political problem capable of political solutions. And those are the practical Zionists. But for others, it is a religious problem. The ultra-Orthodox condemned Zionism from the beginning. It was folly to think that humans could do the work of God, and the regathering of the people from exile was God's work, Messiah's work. There are 2 ways to solve this problem for the ultra-Orthodox. The first is Messianic Zionism. Messianic Zionism claims that the secular Zionists are divinely ordained, that although it is secular people doing it, God is working through them. That they claim that God is using the secular Zionists to prepare for the coming of the Messiah and his Messianic kingdom. So it's kind of a messianism without a Messiah. Messiah will come eventually. Some precedents for this view can be found in the teachings of Kabbalistic mysticism from the Middle Ages, that messianic redemption was the collective responsibility of the community. Thus, the apparently secular work of establishing Israel is really the work of God. As one rabbi put it, the end is being revealed before our very eyes. The end is here. The implications of such a view are far-reaching. If God is superintending the action of Israel, it is a short step to think that Israeli actions must always be correct. Its wars always just. Another rabbi. From the perspective of faith, we see the divine hand spread over us, and especially over our wars. It leads us to recognize the righteousness of our actions and of our wars, their indispensability, not only for us, but for all nations. War is good, indeed indispensable, because military wars are really spiritual wars. Another quote, "The wars of Israel represent the steps of the Messiah marching toward his own coronation." One couldn't ask for a clearer statement of a holy war theory, and once one sees what God is doing, who could resist helping out? Just so, the Messianic Zionists are not content merely to endorse Israeli actions, they want to direct them. They want to establish a great Sanhedrin as the ultimate authority for interpreting the law in Israel. They favor the expansion of Israeli territories and are adamantly opposed to the reestablishment of any Palestinian state. They want to draw the biblical boundaries, which there are a couple, and that is Israel, and nothing must be done to violate that sacred space. And since the tradition speaks about the Messiah coming into the temple, they seek to have it rebuilt, even working with some American fundamentalist Christians to find a perfectly red heifer necessary for the purification sacrifice. That is, the biblical mandate for entering the temple realm is to be purified by the ashes of a red heifer. And since none has existed for a long time, no Orthodox Jew is allowed to go onto the Temple Mount. Rebuilding the temple will require such an animal. Now, Maimonides, back in the Middle Ages, said there had been 9 such animals born, and a 10th one would soon be born, and that is the one that we're waiting for. The melody proved not quite up to. And while rebuilding the temple has always seemed to me like a crazy idea, a recent article in the New Yorker says 11 of the members of Netanyahu's coalition favor rebuilding the temple. That from the January 21 issue of this year. I stress that this is a minority movement even among the ultra-Orthodox, the majority of whom reject the idea of humans doing the work of God. We must continue to await the Messiah. In fact, one group of Hasidim believe that waiting has paid off, that Messiah has appeared. Now, the history of Hasidism is too complicated to enter into here. Just to say it originated as a mystical movement in Eastern Europe. They see God as eminent in the world and tend toward a kind of a pantheistic view of God, with a strong emphasis on the role of the Rebbe, leadership passing from father to son. The founder was the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. And if you've read Chaim Potok's The Chosen, that's a fictional representation of a Hasidic movement in the United States, very much like the Lubavitcher Hasidim. That is the faction that emigrated from Lubavitch in Russia to New York City in the 1940s. Their leader is the Rebbe Menachem Schneerson. He became increasingly convinced that the Messiah was to appear in his own time. I think we have the rabbi. A dynamic man that lived into his 90s. Some of his worldwide followers began to wonder if perhaps he was not the Rebbe, not the Messiah that they had long waited for. And in 1992, explicit claims were made on his behalf that he was the Messiah. And when I was in Israel in 95, there was a big sign in the window of a skyscraper saying the Messiah in Hebrew with his picture underneath it, without rebuke. But alas, he died in 1994 at age of 92, childless and without heir, so that the hereditary office of the Rebbe came to an end. The movement is fractured into different groups, but it's not the end of the story. One faction proclaims he is the Messiah, he's just in hiding. Shades of the Mahdi. So are we waiting for the Messiah, most Orthodox, celebrating his arrival, the Lubavitch, or preparing for his way, Messianic Zionism? Either way, the end-time scenario plays a leading role in the politics of Israel and its neighbors. Now, these neighbors have their own end-time stories and are also divided between waiting and working. The great modern crisis in Islam stems from the cultural, political, and economic domination of the West, and this inequality is typified by the loss of Palestine to the Jews, so that the founding of Israel is also an eschatological event for Islam, but a negative one, which is worrisome to a secularist like me, that both the Jews and the Muslims regard the founding of the State of Israel as apocalyptic and end times worthy, but do so with opposite valuations, some thinking it positive and others thinking it a sign of the end. Now, historically, Sunni Muslims have had less interest in the end times than the Sufis. Some even deny that the Mahdi idea is valid. Most accept it. They have generally been the dominant majority party, and the majority party is not the group that's known for apocalyptic longings. It was the minority party, the Shia, who developed elaborate theories of the hidden Imam and the future coming of the Mahdi. The Shia, you will recall, are the Shia Ali, those who believe that Ali was the proper heir to his father-in-law Muhammad, inheriting both civic and religious authority. The Sunnis believe the Caliph inherited only civic authority. They maintain their own line of descent, the Shia, through 7 or 12 generations. Different schools take different numbers. After which the guided one, the Mahdi, entered a different reality hidden from the world. This proved to be a powerful idea, so that many Sunnis today expect their own Mahdi to appear from heaven. One effect is to downplay the return of Jesus and to focus on the Mahdi. Historically, Sunni and Shia have seen the task of the people as to await the return of the Mahdi, which would inaugurate a series of eschatological events. We saw last week that the success of the Mahdi of Sudan dampened apocalyptic enthusiasm amongst the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and that is true generally of the Sunnis. In the meantime, Sunnis attempt to live according to Sharia, as spelled out by the 4 schools of law. Shias, in a similar manner, have lived under the guidance of the community of jurists. It was their view that the community of jurists could discern the will of the Mahdi and make proper rulings. But 3 events transformed this waiting into active seeking in the late 70s. These are the attack on the Kaaba in Mecca that we talked about last week, the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion showed that not only the need for resistance, but also the threat to the non-Muslim world. The attack on Mecca showed the need for guidance and a strong leadership. And the overthrow of Shah showed that success was possible with strong leadership. The leader of the revolution was Ayatollah Khomeini, who developed a new theory of ruling for the Mahdi, an individual theory, that he had the power to discern the will of the hidden Imam, a strategy that gave him complete control over the developing revolution. He sought nothing less than to establish a full Islamic society, previously thought to be the work of the Mahdi. True to the end times model, violence was justified against the powers of evil, and behind all that was wrong with the world was the demonic hand of the United States, defender of Israel and supporter of the Shah, and above all, quote, tempting the believers to imitate the vilest immoralities of the West. Even so, far more Muslims than Americans were killed in establishing the Islamic State. Not without opposition, K solidified his power in the hostage crisis, in which he showed he could stand up to the great Satan. He also gained stature in the ensuing Iran-Iraq war, where he fought the powerful Sunni neighbors to a standstill, along with its U.S. allies. War propaganda was fully employed messianic myths and the cult of the martyrs, and the Shia founding tradition of suffering. Amongst the images I found highlighting that is this one, which I think is quite revealing. This is a mother holding her dead son. You can see the son draped across her lap. The Ayatollah stands behind her on a white horse, and more soldiers coming out here to fight the war. Untrained teenagers were sent into battle wearing plastic keys around their neck, which are keys to paradise. Fountains in Iran were dyed red and elaborate wedding chambers for the martyrs were set up around town. Khomeini's power was absolute, setting up a civil government that had to act according to the laws and procedures over which he had total control. He adopted the title Imam, the first living Shia to do so since the 12th Imam disappeared. Now, Imam means just leader in Sunni Islam, and any mosque leader is called an Imam, but in Shia Islam, the Imam is the Mahdi. This activism did not go unnoticed. It's at this exact time that Osama bin Laden founded Al-Qaeda, shortly after the death of Khomeini. Now, I do not think that bin Laden is apocalyptically motivated, or was apocalyptically motivated. I don't think Al-Qaeda is a religious movement primarily. But I do believe they use end times motifs to recruit and motivate their followers, the Black Banner hadith being only one of them. His new definition of jihad is all the more dangerous by its coincidence with the reinvigoration of Islamic end times expectations. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, both seen as apocalyptic places, have intensified and confirmed the wildest scenarios of the approaching end times. And the current Syrian situation fits all too well a common, if uniquely Iranian scenario, that the U.S. and Israel will establish a satanic government in Damascus, which will extend its influence over Syria and Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. The ensuing battle between Satan's forces and those of the Mahdi will be led by Ahmadinejad. Notice, not the Mahdi. The assassination of the Mahdi's representative in Medina will, however, provoke the Mahdi to return and gain the victory. Even more troubling is that some versions of this myth, Ahmadinejad's advantage is the atomic bomb. That such a myth is circulating is troubling, but should not be emphasized too much. As near as I can discern, only about half of the Muslims and Christians see the present moment as through the lens of end times thinking, and even fewer Jews. And most of these fall into the waiting camp. A small minority advocate action to hasten the day, and a small fraction of these think that some violence is appropriate. Even the Grand Ayatollah of Iran condemned the bombings of the Boston Marathon. We should be clear. Very few Christians want to blow up federal buildings to overthrow the federal government. Very few Jews want to bomb the Dome of the Rock and build a third temple. And very few Muslims want to take up arms and become terrorists. But as the Boston episode illustrates, a few can cause havoc. Who would have thought that a wounded teenage boy could bring the whole city of Boston to a standstill? And part of the blame for the use of violence to remake the world must fall to the end times ideologues. At the very least, this end times thinking with this notion of a final battle between good and evil provides a justification for violence. Will not cause it, but will make it more sensible if others bring it up. The justification of righteous violence through the myth of holy war is easier when you believe that the other is demonic, and even more likely if you're convinced that you live in the last days, the two other elements of the end time scenario, common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is not to say that the idea of the end is without value. Insofar as it reminds us to aspire to a better future, it can be a force for good. It can also remind us that there is a moral dimension to history. But the end betrays us through its naive dualism of good and evil, an ideology of black and white in a world of grays. The end betrays us when it tempts us to violence and coercion. The end betrays us when it deceives us into thinking that we should use coercive power of the state to enforce God's laws. Theocracy is just another name for forcing other people to live by our religious convictions. Ruling in God's stead has proven time and time again to be tyranny, not millennial bliss. End times, envisioned by the literalists in all three traditions, not only envision the end of history, it's the end of modern values. It's the end of democracy. It's the end of pluralism. It's the end of rationalism. It's the end of dissenting views, because truth is already known. Now the meaning of Amos's famous declaration seems somewhat poignant to me. Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord. It is darkness and not light. Now, I do not know whether the Messiah will come. I do not know whether Jesus will return. I do not know whether the Mahdi will appear. My methods of inquiry do not allow me to answer such questions. But as I look at the function of these beliefs and the lives of those who hold them, most fervently, I find more problems than solutions, more social dysfunction than social harmony. This is not where I expected this series of lectures to come out. It's been a learning experience for me, and I hope in some small way for you. I want to thank John Carroll University for making this, my visit, possible. It's been a fantastic experience, and I thank all the members of the faculty, staff, and student body who've made my stay here enjoyable. And I especially want to thank you who are here tonight, and those of you who were managed to come to all 6 lectures. I suspect there are some here who disagree with me, at least I hope so. The freedom to disagree is one of the benefits for not living in the Messianic kingdom. As my grandmother taught me all those years ago, life may be hard, but it's not the end of the world. So, I turn on my auxiliary mic and I hope for some disagreement, or at least a question of clarification. I need one. Jerry's can be counted on.
Do you know, and this is a serious question, and it sounds like it, but do you know of any instance in which a debt's been forgiven at the Jubilee year by some institution?
I do not know of anybody who's doing that.
Repeat the question.
He wants to know that as part of the law of God in the Old Testament is that every 7th year was a year of Jubilee, or a year of Sabbath year, and debts would be forgiven. And capitalism really wouldn't work on a model very much like that. So you have to wonder. I have not read enough dominionist theory to deal with that particular issue, but Rushdoony probably does in his book. Sir?
During the week, I happened to run across a show on cable, and the person was, I thought I was in your lecture. He was doing...
Damn, you don't know where I got my stuff.
But I mean, it was everything you said, including that President Obama is popular and that he would then change, and everything. How powerful are these? I mean, I was amazed. I listened for a whole hour because it was mind-boggling to me that everything you were saying is right there. These were very seriously preaching this. Something by the name of V-A-N-I-M-P-E or something?
Van Impe, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had never run across this. I mean, how powerful are these that they're on these cable shows and people?
It's a whole different subculture. If you listen to Christian radio stations, go to Christian bookstores, go to these sort of mega churches, it's a whole different way of looking at life. And it's a way in which something like the theory of evolution just is not even considered as a possibility, not even divinely superintended evolution, because the Bible says creationism. How powerful are they? I was pleased to see that Rick Santorum finally got laughed off the stage, but he worried me for a while. And Michelle Bachmann would be in this camp. Well, I don't know about 999. That's 666 upside down, you know. Another question or comment? Yes, David.
David, you were talking about how these beliefs can lead to things like the terrorist attacks or to this jihadist movement from Christians, from Jews, from Muslims. Do you think that there's a lack of this understanding in our fight against terrorism or trying to prevent these attacks? Do you think if
I think there
politicians
was.
and police had this understanding, would it help?
I think there was back in Bush's first administration, and I think that we've caught up considerably since then. I suspect that part of our reluctance to get too involved in Syria stems from knowing that that is part of the mythic tradition of Iran, that America will try to invade Syria, and that would be used against us in the region and amongst the jihadists. I think we're trying to keep some distance there. I don't know that that's the reason, but I suspect that somebody in the room talking knows these things. At least I hope to God they do.
Yes, sir.
Do you
sense, or do you feel that there's any human solution to the conflict that we're having today? One would say that certainly education has not resolved the problem, but reverencing the dignity of life, is that the solution? That all religions or humanity as a community grows to a level, a critical level, a critical mass of people that respect the dignity of human life, that will resolve this issue? Is that the only resolutions?
I wish I'm an optimistic person in that, but I can't go that, I don't see that. Because people are as you define them, and the basic element of religious traditions is to define the other as wrong at the least, and maybe demonic at the worst. And so, I think these ideas are extremely powerful. I think you could put 10 intelligent people in a room and they could solve the Middle East peace crisis in a week if they didn't think of anything except the rational process of doing it. But there's all these other economic, emotional, and religious, especially religious factors that enter in, that make it an irrational process, it seems to me. That's just my view. One more. Oh, there we go.
As you were undertaking your Betty research, I wonder if you came across any of the other preparations that are being made as far as like the priest harvests and or do you know the status on any of the other things that they're trying to bring to a point where they can do their deal, take over the Devil Mount?
I do not know of any particular, I've not read deeply enough to get to any particular movements. I do know that there's an American farmer in Georgia who's working with his ultra-Orthodox counterpoints in Israel to try to take Melody's stock and breed it to the point. She has to get to 3 years old and not have any blemish on her surface to be useful. They made it hard because they didn't want it to be easy, I think. I used to start my class called What is Religion by saying, other people's religions is strange. Yours, I know, makes perfectly good sense. So.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Barr.